mean, just to add a bit more colour, I've been probably in the carbon markets since '98. Prior to that, I was sort of more a traditional environment lawyer. But I got a piece of work to negotiate the climate change levy agreement under the UK's climate change levy for the British ceramics industry in '98. And I think, like many people who get exposed to the climate change issue, once you start working in this area, you invariably get, as we say, hooked. It's very difficult to do anything else, I think, once you sort of understand the climate change issue and what is at stake for all of us. It's actually, I think, very difficult after that to sort of go back to sort of any other topic or issue. This is probably more like a lifetime's work, and probably a lifetime's work for our children and grandchildren as well. After that, I was very much involved with the UK Emissions Trading Group and the design of the UK's pilot trading scheme in '99. And then joined an international law firm, Baker McKenzie, to help build their global climate change practice in about 2000, 2001. I worked for the European Commission to design the registry system across Europe and drafted the registries regulation, so effectively wrote the legislation that enshrines the registry system, which is effectively where this carbon asset is held and how it's actually moved around and owned, in effect, by those who buy and sell carbon credits. Worked with the World Bank to design the original Clean Development Mechanism contracts, the Emissions Reduction Purchase Agreements, or ERPAs as they're then called, and with the International Emissions Trading Association and the International Swaps and Derivatives Association to design the contracts for trading EUAs in Europe, and worked with many of the early players in the market, the climate change capitals, the AgCerts, the eco-securities, and then banks like JP Morgan, Merrill Lynch, and so forth when they entered the market in sort of about 2003. And so played quite a long-term role in the market. And then I went to Climate Change Capital, which is a boutique sort of investment bank in the space, and worked with them for 2 years as general counsel to the carbon funds, helped to raise their $1 billion carbon fund, which is still the biggest private carbon fund in the market, and spent quite a bit of time in China and India actually negotiating and structuring some of the biggest CDM projects in the market before joining Norton Rose, I think now 3 years ago. And effectively the mandate at Norton Rose was to build a global climate change practice, which is what we've been doing for the last 3 years, because this is a global subject, and certainly for business and for the practice of law, it is international. So the projects that we do, we have a map which we'll sort of finish on, which shows the projects that we work on or have worked on around the world. And there's probably now projects, whether they're CDM projects, joint implementation projects, carbon trading projects, or clean technology investments in almost every continent of the world and almost every country in the world. So it is very much an international business and an international endeavour, whether you're in sort of business, whether you're in private practice as a lawyer or as a consultant, or however you are sort of involved in this market. So that's the kind of perspective. What I want to talk about today, and probably to some degree this title is driven, I think, by post-Copenhagen sentiment. Probably wouldn't have used this title before December. But I think that, for those of us who've been very much involved in the market, very much involved in the build-up over the last 2 or 4 years, which is, in effect, the negotiations that led to Copenhagen and the results we got out of Copenhagen have been going on for four long years. And talking to many negotiators now, sort of wondering, obviously they are seriously questioning to some degree, whether the degree to which they may or may not have wasted their lives over the last 4 years of intense negotiations on intensely technical documents and negotiating texts, which started off at sort of 600 pages or more, and they had got them down to sort of 30 pages or so by December, but pretty much most of those were just put aside, and we got a sorry, is there a background echo. We effectively got a document of just a sort of few pages that is sort of a very simple document and drew, in terms of the actual negotiating text, the detailed text drew very little on that, although many of the concepts in the Copenhagen Accord have been drawn from those negotiations. So an international carbon market, fact, fiction, or fancy. And I'm going to sort of, I think, try and lay the foundations for that, and I think Murray's talk actually is quite a good complement to this, because he will then look at what this means in practice and the sort of opportunities and so forth. But I think, and again, my apologies if I'm going over old ground, but I think it is always good to start these talks by actually looking at the underlying issue. What actually is bringing us here today, what is actually driving the actual policy and the regulation and everything that's being implemented. And, it is a physical, a scientific reality. The majority of the world's scientists are, across a multiple range of scientific disciplines, are telling us with increasing urgency that we have a very, very big problem, climate change. And here's just a summary of the IPCC's fourth assessment report. And again, I'm sure you heard yesterday that the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, is part of this legal, international legal structure. It is a body under the UN that brings together the world's scientists on a peer-reviewed basis to assess global climate change science every 5 years and effectively produce a report. And that report, like the climate change negotiations and the policy and the regulation, is heavily negotiated. And certainly the last IPCC report came out under the Bush, or when the Bush administration was in power in the US. And many people still think that it was watered down to some degree, even though some of the findings in that report are quite hard-hitting. Many climate change scientists felt that the report should have been even more strident. The outcomes, the views should have been even more hard-hitting, if you like. But what it is telling us is that, almost, as far as you can be certain in the sort of scientific basis, man-made greenhouse gas emissions are causing a change to the climatic system. And that global warming is happening, and we're on a trajectory for quite significant climate change. Now, if we can achieve 80% reductions in man-made emissions globally by 2050, and to put us on that trajectory, we have to achieve global cuts of somewhere between 25 and 40% by 2020, then we have a sort of 50-50 chance, and this is actually what I find quite scary, of stabilising global climate change at 2 degrees or less, effectively average global warming at 2 degrees or less. And again, the scary thing is in extremes on the planet, the poles, for example, tops of mountains and so forth, that average temperature will be much higher. Now, I think one of the things that it is worth understanding is that Kyoto and the Copenhagen Accord and all of these other policies and measures, the EU Emissions Trading Scheme, none of this is there to stop climate change, because at 2 degrees, and actually I think we'll talk a little bit about how realistic that 2 degrees is, in fact, looking at what's on the table. But at 2 degrees, there's an awful lot of climate change that is going to happen, and a whole other side of the international negotiations and the debate is adaptation. I mean, I will largely, and I suspect Murray will largely focus on mitigation, so taking action to reduce emissions, to stabilise climate change. But at 2 degrees, or probably more, as many people are now saying, 3 or 4 degrees, in reality, if we don't do something more dramatic than we're doing at the moment, we're going to have a lot of climate change that is going to happen, a lot of very dangerous climate change that we're actually going to have to adapt to. And that's a whole another part of the equation that's out there, and it's worth being aware of that, which is going to cost billions to adapt, let alone the billions we're going to have to spend on mitigation. But the point of mitigation, is not to stop climate change, but it is basically to sort of rein it in and to basically stabilise at a level where you do not get huge amounts of feedback effects and in effect, runaway climate change. So that actually it does not go beyond our control. Because there will be a tipping point where we will get to, if we don't do anything, where it is beyond our control. And in effect, whatever we then do would be pointless because we won't be able to stop it. There will be so many feedback effects that will be set in motion that actually anything that we do will have almost no effect. Unless, of course, you believe in huge geoengineering projects to effectively suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and so forth. But as I understand it, those might be theoretically possible, but the side effects of that sort of scale of geoengineering on a planet-wide basis, one would cost an order of magnitude or several orders of magnitude more than it will cost us to mitigate, and the side effects are completely unknown. So that could cause a host of other problems. So that's so now that we've got ourselves on a really cheery and positive note, let's look at what it will cost. There's a significant amount of money that needs to be deployed. I'm not going to read out those figures, but I think the key point to take away from this is that the majority of that money, it is quite clear, will have to come from the private sector. So when people talk in the Copenhagen Accord about 30 billion being mobilised between 2010 and 2012 in terms of fast-track or prompt start financing, and when Hillary Clinton gives a press conference in Copenhagen talking about mobilising, so not committing, mobilising is the word that's used, $100 billion by 2020, probably at least 80% of that must come from the private sector. So not from public coffers. Now, the private sector is only, probably, all of us in business, all of us in companies, we are human beings. We care about the climate change issue, and probably, when you sit on an investment committee, when you make an investment decision, when you are out there examining emissions reduction opportunities, you will feel good about doing that. So it may oil the wheels a little bit in terms of making that investment decision, but the reality is you're only actually going to do that in a business context if you're going to make money out of doing that. So it might mean that, because it's a climate change project, and we know this is happening, the IIR that you will have to achieve may be slightly less because it's a climate change project and because of these moral human considerations than another project that doesn't have a climate change benefit, but there still has to be a clear financial win in doing that. And so the only way that this 80% is going to be mobilised from the private sector is if mechanisms are created that effectively create the right risk-reward balance for business. And ultimately, that's what this whole climate change regime is about. It's about creating a financial incentive for business to go out there and invest in emissions reduction projects. That's in effect what the EU ETS is attempting to do. That's in effect what the Clean Development Mechanism is attempting to do, and all the other market mechanisms that were being discussed, up to and including Copenhagen, for example, sector-wide mechanisms for developing countries. So, but I think the optimism I think can be drawn from that box at the bottom. In many ways, we are still in the early, maybe not in the infant stages, but we're still in the toddler stages, if you want to draw an analogy with human development, of the carbon market. We've created something new on a scale that's not been tried before. So, of course, it's not going to be perfect, but it's all that we've got, and we actually have already begun to identify what doesn't work, and we've started to fix the problems in the EU ETS. We started to fix the problems in the Clean Development Mechanism, and we are creating a mechanism that has actually mobilised significant amounts of capital. There's now quite a lot of studies showing the EU ETS has achieved emissions reductions, and the CDM mechanism has already mobilised something like $94 billion in investment into emissions reduction projects. So it is a relative success, and compared to many of the private sector funds in this space, many of the public sector funds and government money that's actually been deployed, that is significantly more already. So it is, I think, a positive story. So what is the global carbon market? Well, this slide attempts to show the global carbon market as it exists today. And in effect, what I like to describe as the sort of beating heart of the global carbon market is the EU emissions trading scheme. That is the mechanism that drives demand for carbon credits, whether it's EU allowances or whether it's certified emissions reductions, CERs, from the Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM, in developing countries. And it does this because it effectively, I'm sure you heard yesterday, puts a cap on some 11,000 or more installations across Europe. And those installations effectively have a choice. They can reduce emissions in the installation if the cost of reducing emissions per tonne of carbon is less than the cost of a carbon credit, or if the cost is more, they can buy carbon credits and effectively pay someone else to reduce emissions where it's actually cheaper for that other person. So in the economy as a whole, you achieve the same emissions reductions but at a cheaper cost. And that makes it easier for politicians to put carbon caps in place. And there's a number of studies that have shown this in the SO2 market in the US. So actually, overall, you get tougher caps through a market-based approach like this because of that market flexibility. And it rewards those who reduce their emissions, because by reducing your emissions more than your target, you effectively free up an asset that you get paid for. So, and it also unleashes a huge amount of business and entrepreneurial energy. So as we've seen in the global carbon market over the last decade or so, many private sector companies have sprung up, and their sole business is to go out around the world, find emissions reduction opportunities, identify those, and bring investment to those in a way that you would simply not get under traditional command and control or under a carbon tax. So it's a very, very powerful mechanism that unleashes a huge amount of energy and entrepreneurship and investment that you simply don't get from other mechanisms. But there's still problems with it, and there's still flaws that need to be fixed. But I think one of the wonderful things about it is under a market-based approach, the problems and the flaws are completely transparent. So, for example, if you take phase one of the EU emissions trading scheme, there was over-allocation, effectively because emissions had never been measured at these installations before. There was a lot of guesswork in determining what the emissions were and what the caps should have been and what the allocation of allowances should have been. And to some degree, governments relied on the data coming in from businesses, and businesses, like always, were optimistic about their future growth plans and their future emissions. So there was over-allocation. But the wonderful fact about the EU ETS is that over-allocation was completely transparent. The minute the first year's data came in, the market could see what the over-allocation was, and it made a huge price correction. So effectively, you could not hide that. Now, under a carbon tax or under command and control regulation, that over-allocation would have probably taken many more years to become as clear and as obvious as it was under the market-based approach. It then allowed the European Commission and governments the political space to be tougher in the allocations for phase two and for phase three. So effectively, the market mechanism, through that transparency, it's easily corrected in a way perhaps other mechanisms would not be as easily corrected. Now, the interesting thing, I think, for the global carbon market is through the linking directive, which amended the EU emissions trading scheme, project credits, so the credits under the Clean Development Mechanism in developing countries, effectively are recognised for compliance. So you can go to China, you can go to India, you can invest in an emissions reduction project there, create the project credits, and you can bring them back to Europe and use them for compliance. But it's the fact that you've got this cap and trade scheme in Europe where effectively installations have to buy carbon credits and they have to surrender those as against their emissions or face a substantial financial penalty that drives demand. So somewhere in this overall system, you need that cap, you need that demand source. At the moment, the majority of that demand comes from the EU Emissions Trading Scheme. As we show on the slide, there are some fledgling schemes emerging at a sort of sub-national level in other countries, in Australia and New South Wales, in the US at a state level, which we'll look at as we go through the presentation. But they don't really compare to the demand created by the EU ETS at a private sector level. There's also government demand for those credits because governments, again, can buy those credits and use them for their international compliance under the Kyoto Protocol. I guess, unfortunately, I got the slides for yesterday quite late, so I'm assuming a lot of this basic ground in terms of defining CDM and the EU ETS was covered yesterday. So good, some nods. And I'm assuming to some degree that CDM was covered yesterday, but effectively you have this UN-endorsed regulatory approval process for CDM projects. Now, the reason the UN maintained jurisdiction for that is because effectively under the CDM you can go outside of the Kyoto bubble. The Kyoto bubble was created by those countries that took on caps, so the developed countries or the so-called Annex 1 countries under the Kyoto Protocol. 36 of them in Kyoto agreed to caps. I think it's now 35 because the US hasn't ratified, effectively have these caps. And they've effectively created this Kyoto bubble because they all have an assigned amount, and that assigned amount is represented by Kyoto units, the assigned amount units. Each assigned amount unit is 1 tonne of carbon. And the aggregate number of those assigned amount units for those 35 countries effectively creates a Kyoto bubble, a number of Kyoto units. And once that Kyoto bubble was created, so the total number of assigned amount units was set for each country, you cannot effectively create any more Kyoto units with one exception, which is a CDM. So you can go outside of that Kyoto bubble into developing countries like China, India, Brazil, etc., and you can create new Kyoto units for a CDM project. But it was felt that that needed to be policed very carefully because the countries themselves, because they didn't have a cap under Kyoto, would have no incentive to police that because it didn't matter to them whether they created these units or not. So it's effectively policed by the UN and something called the CDM Executive Board. And again, I'm sure you covered that in some detail yesterday. So in my career, certainly in the last 10 years or more, I've been involved in a lot of CDM projects. And I just want to take a little bit of a look actually at that process for investing in a CDM project and what some of the sort of risks are around that. How many people here have been involved in sort of project finance of more traditional energy projects or any kind of project financing or infrastructure investment at all? Anyone in the room? Okay. So you will probably recognise some of the risks. Sometimes I have a slide which is I took from some of my project finance colleagues that shows sort of additional risks for sort of project financing and tries to sort of and effectively looks and add on some of the additional CDM risks. But at the end of the day, the map of risks probably looks very similar to sort of those you would face in a project financing or in an infrastructure type investment. And the traditional, and I use that word very carefully, traditional, because I think it will now evolve into something more complex. It has to evolve into something more complex if this sort of international offset market is to sort of move forward and effectively scale up to the level that it needs to scale up to reduce the emissions. But at the moment, many of the CDM projects today have been a very simple structure. You have a project seller or a project developer that develops an emissions reduction project, and you have an investor or buyer. And generally the investment or the purchase is driven off the basis of effectively an off-take type agreement. So an emissions reduction purchase agreement. And that agreement, in many senses, to me, is a hybrid, a fairly simple hybrid between a commodity type agreement, an off-take agreement, and a project finance agreement. It borrows elements from those different types of regimes because you've got effectively a tradable commodity, the CER. You're off-taking it, so an underlying activity actually has to happen to generate that CER. but you're doing it on a sort of long-term basis, and you have to assess that underlying activity over 5, 7 or more years. So you have to have a certain understanding, and you have to manage in your contract certain activities that would take place over that period of time that you wouldn't normally worry about in a traditional offtake type agreement. So the ERPA is a sort of combination or borrows elements from all of those different sort of worlds in terms of the actual agreement. And generally, the sort of issues you deal with is, the regulatory issue is what's perhaps very different. The registration process within the UN, which again I'm sure if it was covered yesterday, you would understand can be quite complex, quite bureaucratic, and the timing of which can be quite uncertain. And that late commissioning, underperformance, many projects have underperformed and generated less emissions reductions, and therefore CERs, than was originally thought. The landfill gas projects, or the early landfill gas projects, are a very good example of that. Poor monitoring leading to effectively delayed issuance of the CERs. If you have poor monitoring, the CDM Executive Board may effectively question the verification that's submitted, and therefore that delays effectively the issuance of your CERs. The assumptions in many of these projects to date is that the seller is responsible for managing the successful development of the project. The buyer pays for the CERs as they're delivered, although increasingly you have upfront payments and investments and loans structured around and repaid by the delivery of the CERs, which can be quite interesting. And some of the risks, so you've got licensing and regulatory, political, financial, technology, cost delay, and the sort of credit issues around the counterparty. I always remember bringing up the credit issue, one of the big projects that I worked on, which was a big HFC 23 project in China. I think when I was at Climate Change Capital, the Juhua project, which is still the biggest private sector syndication of a CDM project. And when we were there originally for the original due diligence, and we sort of raised the whole credit issue, they pointed to a plaque on the wall, and China has its own credit rating system, if you like, and it's effectively they pointed to a plaque on the wall that said they were AAA plus. And so we chuckled, because at that time, there was very few entities in the West. Even sort of Ford and General Motors then were sort of a B or C, probably much less now. I guess we're chuckling a little bit less now, because maybe Juhua is probably its credit rating as a Chinese international chemical company is probably higher than many of the investment banks and so on, who at that time had a higher Western credit rating by Standard & Poor. But it is a big issue, or can be a big issue in these negotiations. And I think, so that's all very well, but one of the big issues that we're now facing is that policy and regulatory side, I think, is assuming a bigger and bigger importance, because many of the projects, this sort of projects that will deliver and were easy, sort of the horrible term that's used in this market a lot, low-hanging fruit, have now been done. The bigger CDM projects, the bigger project-based CDM projects have all been effectively invested in. They are now under contract, they're now delivering, and even the medium-sized projects are. And many of the harder projects are now being done, but many of them now, at the time they are effectively identified, developed, invested in, the majority of the credits from those projects will be delivering post-2012. And so there is a very big question mark for many of those projects now about, will those CERs from those projects be recognised post-2012? Will they be, even if they're recognised and issued, even if the CDM exists post-2012, and there was an article by Fiona Harvey in the Financial Times last week, which actually I think is wrong, but where she effectively postulated that if there is no second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol on the 1st of January 2013, which is it's highly likely there will not be a second commitment period or an extension of Kyoto on the 1st of January 2013, then there is no longer a legal basis as of that day for the CDM. I actually think that's wrong, but that sort of policy and regulatory, that sort of post-2012 policy and regulatory uncertainty now is a huge dampener on the market. And the other side of that is, even if the CDM is still there with a legal basis and is still issuing CERs post-2012, what is the demand for them? And the demand, the ability to use them for compliance, is what creates the value in those and is the basis on which analysts determine the price of those CERs. And I think it's very difficult at the moment for many financial institutions to effectively price a post-2012, a 2013 or a 2014 CER. And that's, I think, causing some issues in sort of transactions going forward as we get, 2013 is not getting further away, it's getting closer, but we effectively still have that post-2012 policy and regulatory uncertainty. And Copenhagen did very little. In fact, I think it did nothing to give us the sort of policy and regulatory certainty that we need on a post-2012 basis. So let's actually look then at what's happened in the negotiations and, Copenhagen. Now, the road to Copenhagen, you maybe have heard of the Bali Action Plan from COP13 in Bali in 2007. But effectively, what you had is you had the need for effectively a sort of dual or twin-track negotiating process. So you had negotiations under the Kyoto Protocol, and any of you who followed the negotiations, you'd have heard the reference to the AWGKP, the Ad Hoc Working Group on the Kyoto Protocol. Effectively, that was set up some 4 years ago, so 4 years of negotiations, to agree an additional commitment period and various other issues around that, so effectively new targets under the Kyoto Protocol for a second commitment period. But the problem with that is that the United States is not a party to the Kyoto Protocol. It only effectively has observer status, so it could not participate in those negotiations, and politically it's impossible for the United States to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, even a second commitment period. It just, under US domestic politics, that will simply not happen. So there was a big dilemma for the international community. How do you involve the United States in these negotiations? Because going forward, it's all very well for the rest of the world, and particularly Europe, to have picked up the baton and to have kept the Kyoto Protocol alive and to have got this far. But everybody knows any long-term solution has to involve the United States. And obviously China, Brazil and India and the big emerging economies, but the political reality is they will do very little if the United States is doing nothing. So you had to find a way to involve the United States. Now, the United States is a party to the Kyoto Protocol's parent, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it has ratified that, and it has certain obligations under that in terms of data and in terms of putting in reports on its emissions and so on. So it's not completely outside of the legal regime. So a second stream was effectively set up under the Framework Convention, the AWG LCA on long-term cooperative action, effectively, which took over from 2 years of negotiations on a sort of long-term vision that had already been going on since 2005. And you had the second negotiating stream or second track, the AWG LCA. So effectively you had two streams of negotiations going forward, which plus lots of other subsidiary and technical bodies, which made the whole negotiating process very complex. This slide effectively summarises the scope of the LCA, so adaptation, mitigation, financing, and technology transfer, and effectively trying to come up with a shared vision, including the United States, on what's on a new agreement. And I mean, for any of you who actually, I don't know how many of you actually followed the negotiations in detail, particularly in the last 6 months and at Copenhagen. Norton Rose was following that in some detail, and we were at the negotiations. We had a team in Poznan, and we had a team of people throughout in all of the negotiations throughout 2009. And from Bangkok in October, we were doing a daily blog from the negotiations. And if you actually want to understand that whole sort of roller coaster and get a feel for what happened there, and to some degree a feel for how why we ended up where we did in Copenhagen, I'd encourage you to go and read those blogs. I mean, we tried to keep them obviously informative, but also amusing, and try to be relatively light as well. So I think they're an interesting read, and you get a lot of the colour from the negotiations. But in effect, what really started to become apparent at Bangkok in October is this big disconnect between the developed and the developing countries. So you had a huge argument over structure. Now, many countries, particularly the developed countries, in the EU in particular, but the US and others, effectively felt that if we ended up with effectively two separate agreements, that would be very complex, very cumbersome. And so effectively what they wanted to do was to collapse the negotiations and effectively the final agreement into a single unified agreement. So effectively cherry-pick all the good bits from the Kyoto Protocol and put them into a new agreement under the LCA, under the Framework Convention, which involved the United States, and you just have a single agreement going forward. The developing countries, and it's more complex than this, but they reacted quite badly to that, and there was a lot of concern on their part that what was afoot, what was being planned, was a sort of conspiracy by the developed countries to effectively water down their obligations they already had under Kyoto and effectively remove the legally binding obligations that were already in place and replace it with something else that was less legally robust. And also, I think, concerns that a new agreement would also muddy the clear demarcation between developed countries and developing countries. So, and effectively open the floodgates to those developing countries having to take on similar legally binding obligations. On the developed countries side, that was critical to going forward because I guess many of the developed countries, particularly the United States, and again, this elephant in the room, as we say, US domestic politics was at play here because domestic US politics, Congress, it was going to be very difficult for the US to sign up to anything internationally and even quite difficult to pass domestic legislation if Congress, and particularly the Republicans and the Conservatives, but even Democrats from the coal states, felt that the developing countries, China, India, Brazil, the major developing countries, were doing nothing. So that was a sort of undercurrent, the colour that was going on in the debates. And that took us to Copenhagen and what finally emerged in the final hours. And sort of compressed a lot of this, you could talk about much of this, you could talk about Copenhagen and the whole negotiating process all day, so we're rattling through this at a very quick pace. How much was a lot of this covered yesterday, just to get a feel? Fun? No. But just, so I guess the question is moderate success or abysmal failure? And I think this is a question everybody's trying to ask and at the moment. And I mean, I'm in my business. I've come out. I had my head so involved in those international negotiations for most of last year, and was there, for weeks and flying around the world at all of these international negotiations and meetings. And I'm now back on the ground, feet back on solid ground, so to speak. And I've spent a lot of the last 2 or 3 weeks talking to carbon funds, investment banks, energy companies, natural resource companies. I'm trying to get a feel for what does this mean for our business, for the carbon market. And there is a lot of pessimism at the moment. People, I think there's been a bit of an emotional crash after Copenhagen. Now, I think that's just human nature. It's the pendulum is swinging the other way because our expectations, I think certainly a year ago, the hype, the public, the PR, the media around Copenhagen raised expectations to an extremely high level. And I think in retrospect, in hindsight, it was completely unrealistic that we were going to get the sort of agreement that people were saying we could, a fully functioning, legally binding agreement with, economy-wide caps involving the United States, with commitments from the major developing economies by Copenhagen. It effectively was a good case of overreaching, overextending, I think, in terms of expectations. And the Copenhagen Accord is the result of that effective overreach, that overextension. So I think that the key point is that I would filter some of the negative, some of the pessimism at the moment, because I think that's a natural human reaction to those raised expectations. I think I'm going to reserve my judgment, I think, for a couple of months and then assess the degree to which the Copenhagen Accord has been a success or a failure. Now, it has a lot going for it. I mean, we've had 81, I think, countries have now ascribed to it and put commitments in the annexes. And some of those are relatively impressive. I was at a briefing, a roundtable briefing by the UK's Department of Energy and Climate Change yesterday, their climate negotiators. And yes, the UK will always invest a lot of political capital in this international process, and certainly our Prime Minister, Brown, did as well. So they will put a positive spin on this. They have to, for political reasons. But their view is that the numbers get us within, as we say, in the ballpark of the gigaton reductions that have to be achieved by 2020 if you add up all of the commitments that have now been put into the Accord. And the commitments from the major developing economies, particularly China, but even countries like Indonesia, are quite respectable. And they take us across, they effectively cross the Rubicon in the way that, the big issue was, will those countries actually put numbers out there? Will they actually put commitments to actually take action? And they have done. Now, they're not economy-wide absolute caps, but some of them are quite respectable in that sort of context. We have crossed I'm trying to think of the right word, but it's a key principle now that I think has been established across, that those major developing economies have to commit to take action. And that has now happened. So that I think is major progress. And the Accord effectively covers 80% of emissions, global emissions. So again, that's in terms of coverage, that's significantly more than the Kyoto Protocol by a long way. It also provides significant commitments on financing. But again, note it talks about mobilising. It doesn't talk about governments actually committing that amount. So they've effectively committed to mobilise this amount of financing. And again, as I said, we know that 80%, probably something like 80% of that has to come from the private sector. There are significant commitments on monitoring, reporting and verification. I mean, even China, that was adamant before Copenhagen that it would not agree to any kind of international oversight over what it has done, made some modest but I think important concessions on monitoring, reporting and verification. So again, that's quite critical. And we've got the targets in a document. And I think the other key thing is the political power behind that, those world leaders and presidents that have effectively signed up to this. But another way of looking at it is an abysmal failure. It's not it's only politically binding, it's not legally binding, and that matters a lot. A political declaration can always be easily walked away from, particularly by subsequent governments or administrations, whereas a legally binding document, legally binding international agreements cannot be so easy. It can be ignored, as Canada is doing with Kyoto, but that brings a lot of international consequences. Countries think very hard and very long before they agree to an internationally binding commitment, because of the consequences internationally if they do not meet that international commitment. It is at a much higher order of magnitude than a political declaration. And there's no timetable in the Accord for any of this, and there's no detailed mechanisms in the Accord for implementation. So, yes, there's these commitments, but there's very little substance. It's quite difficult to look at it and say, actually, yes, that these are the steps then that the Accord sets out to achieve these targets, to achieve this financing, to put all this, monitoring, reporting and verification rules in place. And it's very unclear what the infrastructure is. Where was this Accord, under what institutional structure is the Accord going to be taken forward? Because effectively the Accord was agreed out, it was sort of taken outside of the UN process and agreed outside of that process. And there's a lot of debate going on, and I've talked to several friends of mine in the US administration who talk about this as an opportunity, talk about the UN having lost its credibility in the climate change area, and talk about whether there are better institutional structures like the G20, the MEF, the Multilateral Economic Forum, or so on, that would be better fora for these negotiations for climate change. And effectively then, you can have a coalition of the willing and leave outside all of those, pesky, really annoying little countries that make it all so difficult to do. And there's some merit in that. But none of these other institutional structures, global structures, have the infrastructure that the UNFCCC has. and the accord is riddled with references to decisions of the Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC, particularly on monitoring, reporting and verification. So it's actually very difficult, I think, in practice to bring it back. And certainly the UK was saying yesterday it is their objective and policy that the accord is inserted back into the UN process. But I think everybody agrees, and I was actually at Copenhagen, I was on the Lithuanian delegation, so I was actually negotiating for Lithuania. Don't ask me why, or I have no Lithuanian grandmother or grandfather or anything like that, but I was their legal advisor. So I sat through that final plenary from Friday night through to Saturday morning. And, it was quite frustrating that you just had a small number of very vocal countries who were vocal during the whole of the international negotiations, Bolivia, Venezuela, Sudan, and a few others, who would object to pretty much anything and everything. And a small number of countries were able to stop the majority in some ways making progress, although you talk to some people who would say, well, many of those countries were proxies for bigger countries who didn't want to be so obvious, in what they were trying to achieve. For example, China. That debate will go and go. But I think, people are trying to work out at the moment, and it is still not clear how the accord gets operationalised, how it gets taken forward, under what forum. But what is clear is the UN process. If it is to be the UN process, I think everybody who wants to make progress is clear that needs to be reformed. And I was told an interesting story yesterday about Sarkozy, because if you think about it, all these world leaders suddenly turned up, and I think the head of security was telling us at one point that, this is why many of the NGOs got excluded in the final days because of the worries over security, that he was going to be having effectively a limousine with a prime minister or a president turning up every 30 seconds on that Thursday. So it was a huge security nightmare, a huge logistical nightmare in that final week. But they all turned up. And they're used to going to international events where they're handed an almost negotiated document, and they maybe have one or two very high-level points that they have to agree amongst themselves, and then they sign it. They were handed nothing. So you had the biggest concentration of world leaders that has ever met outside of the General Assembly in New York, and they were handed nothing but a blank sheet of paper. And suddenly you had these prime ministers and presidents effectively having to create a document from scratch. And they were borrowing from G8 documents and other documents, and that's why maybe the accord is not as elegant as it could be. And I was told a story yesterday by the UK delegation that Sarkozy, French president, actually he threw a fit. And the UK official yesterday actually did a very good French accent, which I'm not even going to attempt. But effectively, Sarkozy said, I have negotiated with heads of state, I have negotiated with ministers, I have negotiated with international fora. I have never seen the bureaucratic incompetence, that I have seen here. But I think, many of the world leaders have gone away now with the view that this UNFCCC process is broken and needs reform. So it is at that level. And there are lots of moves to see if it can be reformed, to move away from this consensus-driven approach, which was the problem. So let's decide. So now we know we're going to meet in not Mexico City. Actually, I think everybody. It's not official yet, but it sort of is official. It's going to be Cancun. So again, the world's media are going to be presented with the wonderful photo opportunity of climate negotiators at a beautiful beach resort, which we know how that will play. But the question is, what is going to be achieved there? And will the accord be the basis for momentum that gets a legally binding agreement or something substantive in Mexico? And I've been following these negotiations for 10 years, and I don't know. And everybody I've talked to, from governments, from business, just do not know whether we are going to get something substantive, whether the accord will really take off, whether it has, as we say in the UK, has legs. And whether it creates the momentum that is needed. One thing I was told is that the Mexicans already look like they're going to be a competent presidency. They are going to convene a meeting in April where they're going to try and get a core group of key countries to try and take negotiations forward on a more sort of simplified, coherent basis. Now that is likely to be more efficient, but they'll have to be very careful how they play that, because that could obviously upset a lot of other countries. I mean, a lot of countries were very upset by feeling they were excluded from those final negotiations of the Copenhagen Accord. But if you try and negotiate with 190 countries, the practicalities and the realities are that that's very difficult now to actually get any kind of agreement. So there's going to be a very interesting political dynamic this year as we run up to Mexico. So my acid, and I think taking us into the rest of the presentation, I think the success or failure of the Accord will be judged on what actual action on the ground, and by that I mean domestic law, regulation, and investment that actually flows from it. And quite frankly, it would be the same whether we've got a fully comprehensive, legally binding agreement in Copenhagen. The reality of that is, would that then result in legal legislation and policy in countries that requires people to reduce their emissions and incentivizes private sector to invest in emissions reductions? That's the acid test. And if you think of that in terms of dominoes, you ever play this game where you line up dominoes and you knock over the first domino and then all the others fall over. To many degree, certainly I think in terms of whether the global carbon market moves forward, the first domino is the United States, and whether or not cap and trade legislation is passed in the United States. So for me, to be honest, the acid test this year, certainly, to judge whether the Accord is a success or a failure, is whether it sort of facilitates the passing of that legislation in the United States. Because if the United States passes cap and trade, almost certainly Australia will follow suit if they don't sort of do that this month or today. I think it goes to the Senate. Certainly, other countries will then take more significant action if they know the US is taking significant domestic action. It will be much harder if the United States does not pass that legislation this year. That may be overly pessimistic. So, too much conversation, a little more action, please. And the action, I think, is now at the domestic level. It's bottom up. I think that's where the action is in the next year or two. So very quickly, I think you've probably covered Europe, and I actually want to sort of look more at the rest of the world. But I think there is a feeling in the UN, in the EU, and there's a big internal debate about the extent to which the EU put its head above the parapet, went out too far ahead in terms of leadership, and has suffered as a result of that. Certainly, on that sort of Friday, there was a lot of confusion and pandemonium in the UN area. I was actually in that area with the Lithuanian delegation, and just watching as the Accord, they heard the Obama press conference, and many in the EU were taken by surprise. And I think there was a number of hours where there was serious debate in the EU about whether they walked away from the Accord. And there were serious debates about whether an outright failure at Copenhagen was actually better than a compromised political agreement in terms of sending a strong political message and perhaps galvanizing public opinion and action to do something, rather than everyone walking away with effectively a weak political declaration and saying, well, job done, haven't we all done a very good job? And that's climate change now dealt with. But obviously, politically, real politics meant they were never going to undermine Obama in that way. So they obviously fell in and supported it and are now trying to sort of make the best of it. But, I think that one of the key issues, I think, is, certainly for the carbon market, is the Accord sufficient to trigger the move from the 20% target to the 30% target? If we stay at 20%, the sort of effectively the global slowdown and the global slowdown or the economic slowdown in Europe means that the 20% target now is effectively almost achieved across Europe. So it's not, and a 30% doesn't actually look as ambitious as it did. And if we stay at 20%, certainly the view from the UK yesterday and others I've spoken to is we are stuck with a carbon price of between 11 and 13 euros. And we need, to get to the actual level of a carbon price that will drive investment other than just basic fuel switching, we need to move to 30% and 20 euros or more. So that would make a significant difference. But many in Eastern Europe are very sceptical about moving to 30% unilaterally, in effect, on the basis of the Copenhagen Accord. So that debate is going on within the EU at the moment, and I think that's quite critical. We will see. Well, here's a timeline. So there has been a lot going on since Obama got into office. I think both domestically and in the international negotiations, the new administration, has hit the ground running. And the House of Representatives have passed a bill. And of course, as you will all know, the sticking point is the Senate. And of course, the recent election and the Kennedy seat effectively going to a Republican, I think, makes the politics much harder now in the Senate. And there's other priorities, healthcare, finance reform, other than climate change. So, and midterm elections are coming up fairly soon. So if it does not pass in the next legislative window, which is sort of effectively now and is quite a short period, you're into that election cycle, and it probably means it won't pass until, it won't come back until 2011. Barbara Boxer was quoted last week, and again, gives you an idea as to the uncertainty that's there on whether or not this legislation would pass. And she said, well, we could have a climate change act this year. We could have it in 2011. We could have it in 2012. We could have it in 2013. We could have it in 2014. We could have it in 2015. And that was a direct quote from Barbara Boxer, and sort of in the middle of that whole process. So I think it's very uncertain what is going to happen. But actually, just before I do that, I think, and we'll come to this, this other point I think is interesting, the December 14 one. I think the slightly different dynamic for climate change as compared to healthcare is, one, there is an element of bipartisan support for doing something on climate change. There are many Republicans who are, believe as much as many Democrats that action needs to be taken. In fact, there's many Democrats from coal states who are very sceptical. So it's not the sort of it's not as bipartisan as something like healthcare, from what I understand. There's also not a complete vacuum in the sense that with the EPA decision under the Clean Air Act that carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases are a pollutant, it means business is faced with the spectre of being regulated by the EPA under the Clean Air Act on a much more bureaucratic basis, and potentially, from their perspective, on a much more rigorous basis than if there is a cap and trade passed federally by Congress. So business may lobby for that legislation on the basis that they can control that, they can get certain compromises built into that, to sort of make it better for them ultimately than if they are regulated by the EPA under the Clean Air Act. Now, you may have also seen, some of you in the press, that certain Republicans are trying to sort of put something forward in Congress to effectively stop that regulation under the Clean Air Act. But they would face a similar problem in terms of the numbers that they would need to get as a vote to effectively amend the Clean Air Act and to stop that happening. So, I think that's an interesting dynamic. And the other thing that businesses is faced with is if they do not get federal cap and trade, they're effectively looking at a patchwork of legislation at a state level right across the US. And here's just a summary of some of what is going on. The Western Climate Initiative, which is a sort of framework being created in many of the Western states, including Canadian provinces. The heart of that is California. Having said, the Western Climate Initiative, whilst it has been agreed as a sort of overarching framework amongst those states, other than California, there doesn't seem to be any move by the states to pass the actual legislation required at a state level. but it is interesting. RGGI, however, on the eastern side is actually effectively operational, although demand and supply, the caps, again, are fairly low, and the price is relatively low compared to what we're used to under the ETS. And, of course, there is the Chicago Climate Exchange, a sort of voluntary initiative that many companies sign up to voluntarily to sort of and put a voluntary commitment and then effectively trade carbon credits under that voluntary commitment. You will have heard yesterday from David Antonoli from the VCS. I sit on the board of the Voluntary Carbon Standards Association. That, of course, there's also the VCS and a lot of voluntary offset projects being done in the US under the VCS. So we touched on the prospects. I mean, just to bring that right up to date, we had Obama's State of the Union address the other day. So he did make, climate change and dealing with clean energy and climate change was a major part of this. He called for comprehensive energy and a climate bill to make clean energy the profitable kind of energy in America. So obviously he's trying to head off the counter-arguments about jobs, loss of jobs and costs to the economy in a difficult economic climate. But there was no reference to the ETS. But it's not excluded. So there's, again, a big people trying to read the tea leaves. Because he didn't refer to the ETS, because revenues from auctions have just been taken out of the new budget, does that mean that the administration is effectively stepping back from wanting a cap-and-trade scheme? Or is this just politics? They're trying to remove, I think as Murray said to me in the taxi this morning, as many red flags as possible to make it easier to get the legislation through. Well, none of us will know until legislation is or is not passed. But I think the domestic politics in the US are critical here. And I was in the US after Copenhagen. I took a bit of an extended break. I was in the US for a little bit and then Australia, both countries of which are currently debating climate change legislation. Now, during Copenhagen and for that week after Copenhagen to Christmas, there was a reasonable amount of coverage in the US press on climate change in Copenhagen. But come Christmas Eve, it dropped off of the US agenda. It just did not see anything on climate change in the press after that. Contrast Australia, where I was the first 2 weeks of January, it was in the press every single day. It's a major issue, or be a major issue in the election. So yes, it's there's huge political difficulties in getting the legislation passed in Australia, but it's up there in the public agenda in a way that it's not really registering at a public level and in the media on a day-to-day basis in the United States, or the way I think we are aware of climate change and the issue and how important it is here in Europe. So it's a very, very, very different domestic political dynamic in the US. But it's critical. I mean, it's the elephant in the room for any kind of global and international agreement. So I think we've largely passed this. I mean, people who claim, whose opinions I sort of respect, are predicting, yes, there will be an energy and jobs bill or something along those lines, and there will be legislation on renewable energy targets, on GHG regulation in the short term, but it may be that cap and trade is the thing that's lost, that suffers, and that we won't see that in the US for another few years. So, question is, what is that? That's quite pessimistic. But actually, let's be more optimistic. China, I think, is really interesting. I've spent a lot of my time in China over the last 4 or 5 years, and there is a lot happening. In fact, Jonathan Pershing, who head of the US climate change negotiating team, gave a very interesting business briefing in Bangkok, and he came out and said, quite frankly, we don't give the major developing economies credit for actually what they are doing, and they are doing a lot. And now, to be honest, particularly China, but also in some respects India and Brazil and some South Korea and other countries, many of the South American countries on forestry, are actually moving far ahead of the United States. There are certain industrial sectors, steel and cement, for example, in China, that now, per sort of ton of output, are more carbon efficient than their equivalents in the United States. And much of this is through policy and regulation that's being driven by the Chinese government, who do take this seriously. I think I read a transcript of a speech or an interview with a chap who wrote effectively the Australian equivalent of Stern, whose name suddenly escapes me, Garner. And he has an interesting quote that at the moment, China has the biggest nuclear program that's planned, the biggest solar power program, the biggest wind power program, the biggest hydropower, energy from hydropower program. They are putting through policies and regulations now to remove subsidies and effectively almost disincentivize highly energy-intensive industries and activities. And his view is that this program will far exceed the commitment that China have made in practical terms. And the commitment they made is to effectively reduce their carbon intensity. So this is an intensity target rather than an absolute target, so per intensity of output, by 40 to 45% on 2005 levels by 2020. And WRI have said that that's comparable, in effect, to US proposals in terms of absolute emissions reductions, if that's true or not. And there's also moves in China to put in place, there is serious thinking going on about carbon markets and trading schemes. Certainly, as we know, China has been very effective in mobilizing CDM, having more than 50% of the CDM market, partly from their industrial base and the project opportunities, but also the way in which China put policies and regulations in place to effectively incentivize and make it easier for people to come and invest in CDM projects there. They're now several cities are setting up carbon exchanges and looking to partner with exchanges in Europe, and there are discussions about certain trading schemes. So, I think I think China is very interested, and actually the action on the ground is very significant. How are we doing on time? Because I can speed up, or I can. Yep. Get in there. Just tell me how long, and I will.
5 minutes more.
Perfect. Just very quickly, Japan, obviously part of Annex 1. The interesting thing about Japan is it has been, without a mandatory cap and trade scheme, it has been a major player in the carbon market through a voluntary trading scheme. Effectively, I think only in Japan could this really work, where a voluntary scheme is treated by industry in the same way as a mandatory or regulatory scheme. And many of the players, many of the Japanese corporates, trading houses and so forth, actually treat it as seriously as that. But having said that, Japan looks increasingly likely to pass a proper, fully fledged cap and trade scheme, and that certainly is being discussed. And they are after Europe, a major buyer and investor in the market. I mean, many project developers, many of those who develop projects after Europe, they spend a lot of time in Tokyo selling projects and CERs into the Japanese market. And I think actually after London, at the moment, it's the second biggest concentration of carbon finance and carbon professionals and expertise in the world. It just keeps much quieter about it than perhaps London and other parts of the world. So I think Japan is interesting and may well push ahead. Australia leading from behind. Again, happy to talk about this in questions. We may well get a view on that today. It was part of a debate in the Senate yesterday. Tony Abbott, the new leader of the Liberal, effectively the Conservative opposition, has put his plans forward yesterday that in effect said that he will set up a government fund to invest in emissions reduction projects, and they will get the cheapest emissions reductions, and this won't cost consumers or business anything, which is quite interesting. Kind of overlook the fact that consumers and business are taxpayers and probably will have to contribute to the fund, but and I almost certainly think there's no way that proposal will achieve the level of emissions cuts Australia requires. If you look at many of the government purchasing funds in Europe, most of them have not been very successful compared to their private sector cousins. But it's clever politics because the Liberals paint the CPRS as a carbon tax, and they're now saying, we, the government, we will achieve these emissions reductions, and we won't put any costs on industry or on you, the consumer, and you don't have to worry about it. So, from a fairly simple political step, it's actually quite clever. So I think that debate politically could get quite messy in Australia. Canada, the rogue nation, the country that has signed up and ratified Kyoto, but in practice is effectively under its new Conservative government moving away from that commitment. Again, I'll let you read the slide so we can finish very quickly. But quite interestingly, Canada thought they would try and slip in. They're the one country that I think has actually stepped back on their commitments. And in terms of the commitments they put forward under the Accord, they put a slightly less ambitious commitment forward that matches the United States exactly. In fact, a good friend of mine in the US administration, I was just having a drink with him in Copenhagen, and so this is Chatham House, totally off the record. He said to me, God, those Canadians are really beginning to annoy me. And I said, why? He said, well, they keep coming up to me every day and saying, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? What should we do? So basically, Canada will do what America does. South Africa is interesting. Again, the one thing I draw out of this is, South Africa is critical in Africa and is a linchpin and is effectively, I think, one of the sort of key hubs for whatever happens in Africa. And a lot actually has to happen in Africa. Africa is very powerful. I spend a lot of time. I sit on the board of the Carbon Markets Investors Association. I spend a lot of time also in the negotiations, sort of lobbying. In the negotiations, and we had a number of meetings with the African group in Bangkok and in Barcelona and in Copenhagen, and to try and convince them of the merits of CDM, to get them to support CDM reform in the negotiations. And of course, one of their key frustrations was that they've seen very little investment from CDM. And one of the things that we try to convince them of is, well, look, it's a new mechanism. It's unrealistic to expect this to be perfect from the beginning. Of course, the easy options in China, India, Brazil would have got the investment first. But if you support the reforms, so effectively sector-wide baselines, if you support the reform of the CDM Executive Board that it becomes more efficient, and you support the development of programmatic CDM, all of those things will mean that Africa will get more of that investment. And of course, if you get an international agreement that is ambitious, there'll be more demand for credits from CDM projects. There'll be a higher value, and that will make investment in projects in Africa more viable. So we were trying to do a lot of, I think, capacity building, education of those African governments who simply just felt aggrieved because they saw no benefit in these market mechanisms and CDM, because almost none of that investment from CDM had been coming to Africa. And that is important. That's important for us in this market, because if the knock-on effect for our market is we depend on the policy and regulatory certainty, and that's under a sort of UN international process, and Africa as a group is not going to support those market mechanisms and the reform of those market mechanisms if it is not seeing any of the investment from those mechanisms. So it's a very important dynamic that you have to think about. And so I think that, and I think governments understand that. Many governments, such as the UK and the EU, are channeling a lot of this public sector investment will go to Africa. And the EU's tried to provide policy and regulatory certainty to facilitate that. I mean, we do know that there is one group of projects that will be recognised post-2012 in the ETS, and that's projects from least developed countries, and Africa forms those. So we know that you have a degree of certainty that if you invest in a CDM project now in Africa, and that's registered after 2012, that project will be recognised for compliance in the ETS, whereas a project in China or India may well not be. So there is that degree, I think, of support. Russia, well, hot air and indifference. Actually, there was one correction on this slide. Russia has ascribed a target, came in slightly late after the 31st, but it has now got a target. I mean, Russia's been historically quite poor, fairly indifferent. I think the bottom line is that Russia now, its growth and its power depends on its natural resources, its oil and its gas, and that's what it's going to protect at any cost. And taking action on climate change is not a high priority. As we have seen from their position in the negotiations, effectively what they needed to be promised, what they were given to actually ratify Kyoto, and the speed or lack of speed and commitment to effectively putting the rules and regulations in to allow joint implementation projects. I think we are yet to see any credits issued from a joint implementation project in Russia, yet Russia could be the biggest source of, or should be by rights in terms of its industrial base and the project opportunities, the biggest source of joint implementation projects. It's also one of the biggest problems for any future agreement because of the hot air that they have from Kyoto and the feeling that that is a national asset, and on principle, they do not want to give that up. So that's quite a hard, quite a difficult issue in the international negotiations. Here's a summary of some of the others. New Zealand is some good news. They have passed the legislation, although it's quite soft at the beginning. Singapore's interesting, very, very small city-state, but it sees itself as quite influential in Southeast Asia, and it sees itself as the natural carbon hub, like the London of Asia. And it's doing a lot to attract players to set up their trading operations in Singapore, and we're having some very interesting discussions with them about the amount of capacity building that they can do in the rest of Southeast Asia to get carbon markets off the ground in countries like Indonesia and Malaysia and Vietnam, and sector-wide project crediting regimes in place, because Singapore feels that they will win from that in the sense of being a major financial centre and effectively attracting the financing, headquarters and operations and so on. And effectively, if you set up your trading operation in Singapore now, you can do that on a tax-free basis. So they're making a very aggressive play to sort of be that sort of hub in the Asian market. So I think that's quite interesting. So just to sort of wrap up, just what can we expect? Well, I would have been a lot more optimistic about this slide last year. A future global carbon market would be, the beating heart would be sort of joined by a few others: the US, Australia, Japan. US, it is critical. If they pass cap and trade along the lines of the bills that we have seen, Waxman-Markey bill, then that will be 4 times the size of the EU trading scheme. And in terms of the trading, it'll be 20 times, according to some analysts, in terms of the amount of turnover and trading of the credits within that, of the EU ETS. So it will make a huge difference. And the demand for international offset credits will be between 1 billion and 1.5 billion, which basically would soak up pretty much all of the projected output and more of the CDM, before you've even got demand from the EU ETS, Australia and Japan. So it would change the dynamics of this market overnight, and really would lead to a global market. The key thing, I think, in the next sort of 5 or 6 years is you won't see, it's unlikely that these new markets, if they happen this year, will link directly. There's too many political compromises and differences built into them to allow direct fungibility of the credits in the short term. In the long term, they should all link up because they're basically built on the same fundamentals. But these initial political compromises that will be built into them to get them passed will probably make that difficult in the short term. But what they will be linked by is the global offset market. That will be the common currency. Now, the debate in the US is effectively whether they effectively plug into the CDM, and that is possible. And that is in the legislation, and I think internationally that is possible, even if they're outside of Kyoto, or whether they effectively create a competing US offset standard, which is also possible because there's a lot of skepticism in the United States about the CDM itself. And so unless the CDM is reformed, particularly the bureaucracy around the CDM Executive Board, it is likely they'll go down that second route. So let's wrap up. You can read the conclusions, and I think actually, to a large degree, Murray is going to look at the opportunities or risks and gazing into the crystal ball. Global action is inevitable. I actually think the sort of takeaway for me at the moment, and the real question mark, is the degree to which this is top-down or bottom-up. There's always going to be a combination of the two, but I think the coordination, the harmonisation, if you had an internationally legally binding agreement, would be greater. The ambition, the stretch for targets will probably be greater under an internationally legally binding agreement. But ultimately, that always depends on bottom-up action. And I think under the current regime, we're likely to see more bottom-up. It's going to be much more dependent on a bottom-up, country-driven legislation and measures. And that is likely to be a lot less coordinated under what we now have than if we had got a sort of legally binding agreement or a son or daughter of Kyoto. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Anthony, for your detailed presentation and very interesting. I find it super interesting, actually, that two of our speakers today were physically in Copenhagen and can tell us firsthand what the negotiations look like. So now it's your turn, guys, if you want to ask some questions. I think there's one question here.
I think the presentation was very interesting. Thank you. You were talking about somebody in the Financial Times saying that CRs, they will probably not be in place after 2012, or that there might have a legal basis. So this, in combination with something we heard together, the additionality, in my understanding, means that if you don't get the CRs, your project is not economically viable. So they're nowadays constructing a lot of wind farms, and they expect to get 10 years or 20 years of these CRs. So how can you prove that your project is not economically viable if you don't get CRs during 20 years, but you don't know if you really get CRs during 20 years? So the whole system, for me, this is something like the key of the question. How can you prove that your project is not economically viable if you don't get income during 20 years, but we don't know if you give you income during 20 years? Mm-hmm. How can this work together? Is there something I lose in this equation, or I forget?
Well, firstly, to go to it was the Fiona Harvey article in the Financial Times. I don't remember which day it was, but it was, I think it was last week. And I think she's wrong, because the whole legal infrastructure for Kyoto actually has to continue until 2015, because that's when countries haven't to effectively comply with the first commitment period, the 08-12 period. So that whole registry system, a whole UN infrastructure, even if there was no extension to Kyoto, has to remain until 2015. And effectively the international regime gave CDM effectively a quasi-legal basis before Kyoto was even in force, which allowed it to start on a prompt basis. So, I think her article, I disagree, with that conclusion, or I think it needs a lot more examination. The additionality thing I think is interesting. Additionality is actually more than just financial additionality. I mean, financial additionality is one element of additionality. I mean, something can actually, without CDM, you can actually show on paper that something would make money, but one, it may not make the investment hurdles, the IRR that your company would traditionally make. So it may sort of make a profit of 5% on your investment, whereas your company would never invest until something's at 10%, for example, and CDM may actually bring you up to that investment hurdle. It may be that there's regulatory and there's other hurdles outside of purely the financial one, which means that the project would not happen. So yes, it might make the 10% on paper, but actually no one's ever used this technology before, no one's ever done this before, and you can make 10% on something else which is tried and tested, and is a lot less risky in many ways. So just to deal with that, CDM additionality tests are much more than just financial, but that's been a huge debate. yes, I mean, but in terms, I mean, what you are really, I think, putting your finger on is the policy and regulatory uncertainty in this market. And that is, at the end of the day, that is a reality. This is a market which is created by policy and regulation. So politics play a big part in your assessment of that regime going forward. This is why many companies many companies who invest in this area, play in this area, have a number of people employed whose job is to be plugged into the policy and regulatory debate, spending their time in Brussels and Washington, understanding the policy and regulation. It's probably why we as a law firm, yes, we make our money on advising on the transactions and the investments. That's really where we make our money. But we spend a lot of our time plugged into that policy and regulatory debate, and clients pay us for that. We also do a lot of that because we have to, because clients will come to us because they see that, yes, we can do the contracts and the deals and the transactions, but they also know that we understand the policy and the regulatory risks, which go to your point, which is exactly what it is. When you make that assessment on the revenue flows from that project, you will have to factor into that in your investment committee. Certainly when I sat on the investment committee at Climate Change Capital, we would have to assess, if we were basing the investment based on credits going out to 2020, we would give a different value and a different certainty to the credits up to 2012 than we would for credits 2012 till 2018 or 2020, because we would factor in that policy and regulatory risk. And either you will factor it in and give a zero value to them, or you will say, okay, we think the average value of the credits up to 2012 will be €15, and we'll put a value of €3 on the credits post-2012. And that's factoring in that policy and regulatory risk.
Okay, thank you. That was very interesting information. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Maryse?
Thank you. You raised a crucial issue, I think, related to the fact that any climate agreement must be legally binding. But a related issue is the fact that there is no supranational authority to enforce such an international agreement, and I think this is a huge problem with many environmental agreements. And a good example is Canada, and I'm Canadian, so this is a problem we discussed so much times there. The fact that Canada ratified the Kyoto Protocol, and then the government changed, and the new government decided not to do anything. They even declared that it wouldn't try to satisfy their commitments. So what to do? What kind of sanctions can be decided against Canada? I mean, there are some sanctions included in the Kyoto Protocol, but related to the next commitment period. But in fact, I think this is an important, crucial issue to guarantee the implementation of such an agreement. And until now, it's weak.
Well, I mean, I think the critical question is, yes, that's what Canada have said, but they have not they have not failed to comply yet. They're not in breach of Kyoto yet, and they won't be until 2015. So it's like someone in the pub saying, I'm going to go and rob a bank tomorrow. Question, have they committed a crime? Yeah, maybe if they start actively recruiting people and putting a plan together, there might be a conspiracy under certain laws. But you can say, well, they haven't committed the crime yet until they actually walk into that bank and say, stick your hands up and give me the money. They haven't committed a crime. So we don't know yet what the consequences and how robust the compliance regime and what the sort of international consequences for them will be. Although what we do know is a number of international bodies have asked them to be expelled. In fact, there was a call. There's been a call now by the Commonwealth, which is Canada is a part of, by many of the small island nations, for Canada to be expelled or suspended from the Commonwealth because of their actions under the Kyoto Protocol, because it's legally binding, and they're talking about breaching international law. But no, you're right. There isn't an international policeman, but that's the world we live in. We live in a world of sovereign states, and you cannot compare public international law with the law that you and I are subject to in countries with policemen and court systems. But public international, what I was talking about is the comparative difference between a political declaration and an internationally legally binding obligation. I mean, that is about as tough as it gets as between countries when they effectively agree to a legally binding obligation. That's as tough as it gets internationally, and it is to breach that. Does carry more consequences, even in terms of political consequences, than if you breach a political declaration. And there is a compliance regime under the Kyoto Protocol, which is tougher than pretty much every other international agreement, save for GATT and the international trade regime. It's the only regime that effectively has a tougher compliance regime than the Kyoto Protocol. But no, it's not perfect. But international law and the world we live in, the world of sovereign states, is not.
Okay, thank you very much, Anthony.